Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the Social Housing Roundtable. It's lovely to see so many people here at the start of June. I wish the weather knew that we were at the start of June, but apart from that, it's great to see so many fantastic people already in the room. Nearly 50 of us is amazing. So to those who don't know me or those who are new to the roundtable, because I can see some new faces, which is amazing, and you're incredibly welcome. My name is Matt Baird. I am the founder, co-host of the Social Housing Roundtable. This runs every single Tuesday, nearest damn it, at 11 a.m. We did 48 of them last year. We're on course to do 50 this year. We've done about 125 episodes so far. And you can find prior recordings on YouTube and Spotify. Just search the Social Housing Roundtable or reach out to me. The idea behind these was to bring people together away from conferences, which are sometimes really expensive and obviously require a lot of time, to give people the chance to have a true, authentic, honest discussion around anything and everything to do with the social housing world. And I'd like to think we are slowly getting there. But then there are always topics that come up which immediately pique people's interest. And this is definitely one of them. I'm delighted to be running this with Jo Lecke today. This whole venture is run by my recruitment business. So I have been self-employed now for 3 and a bit years. I've been recruiting in the wider social housing world for over 11 years. My request, my favor, I guess, is that this will remain free and open to everybody for as long as I can possibly do it. But the rate that it is funded is because a lot of you use me for your recruitment. So if you are needing recruitment support, please do reach out. I'd be more than willing to talk, help, assist, and show you why I try and do things a little bit differently. So without further ado, I'm going to pass across to Jo Lecke, who we were discussing just before. We don't really know how we met, but we figured it was through one of these in the very early days when I had about 4 or 5 people around the table. But who's become a firm friend of the roundtable, who's done a number of these with me, who is a phenomenal trainer. And she won't like me saying that on something like this, but is a phenomenal trainer. And is someone who I've been a big, big advocate for a number of years now. So I'm delighted to have you with us, Jo. I'll pass over to you to introduce the topic of vexatious complaints, which is probably going to be a really quiet session that no one's interested in. The one thing I will say, straight off the bat, actually, just before we start, this is a place where everybody's view is welcome, everybody's view is wanted, and everybody's view is required in order to make this run in the way that it does. Today, we might have some very polarizing opinions. That is a good thing. I welcome them. I want them. I think one of the biggest issues we have with discourse is that sometimes we immediately just shun anybody who doesn't think the same as us. However, that being said, keep it respectful. I want people to really share ideas in this space. You will be respected. And if anybody wants anything removed from recordings or anything afterwards, please do let me know. On that, Jo, over to you. Lovely to have you back.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, welcome, everyone. It's lovely to see so many familiar faces and familiar names from LinkedIn. And thank you for having me on the session today, Matt. And I thought now was an ideal opportunity to talk about vexatious, what we call vexatious or unreasonable complainant conduct, because organisations are struggling under the weight of the level of complaints that they're receiving at the moment. And not only are housing organisations struggling under the weight of that, but so is the Ombudsman, I think. And so now's a good time really to talk about this really nutty issue, because it really is a nutty issue. I have got a little PowerPoint to share with you because I've got some interesting facts and statistics and things to share. So I'm going to share my screen. So if you bear with me a minute, I'll just sort myself out. Ready to go. I can now. So you're all seeing that screen share all right. Please tell me you're seeing it all right. Moved you all up onto my big screen, which is why I'm looking up at you now. Okay, right. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Jo Lecke and I'm the owner and the principal consultant at Big Picture Training. And Big Picture Training provides customer service and customer experience training and consultancy into the not-for-profit and the associated sectors with a focus on the social housing sector. And Matt has kindly invited me along today to talk about vexatious complainants. And we've called this roundtable vexatious or vexed. And the question is, are complainants who have been categorised as a problem vexatious or simply vexed by their landlord? So can you run the first poll, Matt, for me? I've got a little question that I'd like to ask you. So can you run that first poll, Matt? Fantastic. So the poll on the screen. So in your personal lives, guys, if you are unhappy with a service you've received, do you make a formal complaint? Gosh, there's 58 of you on the session today. That is fantastic. Absolutely fantastic. Shows how important this issue is. And so I think the majority of you have voted now. So I think you can probably safely end that poll now, Matt. So if we share the results then, Matt, with everyone, you can see here that 72% of you have said, I often think I will complain, but I don't bother. 8 of you have said you always complain. And I'd like to think I fall into that category, because I will make a complaint because I want the organisation to learn something from the experience that I've had. And that's because of what I do for a living. I'm very heightened. I've got heightened awareness around customer experience, customer service. So I'd like to say that I always complain. The reality is I don't always complain, actually. You know, my cleaners came into the office the other day. I didn't think they did a brilliant job. They rang me up to ask me what I thought, and I just said, yeah, it was all right. And they took that and they were happy with that, and off they went. I couldn't be bothered to make a complaint. I thought I'll deal with that if it happens again. And then 7 of you have said, no, you don't complain. Complaining customers are actually gifting us with an opportunity to find out what their problems are, so that we can help them learn from our mistakes and improve our services ultimately at the end of the day. But research has shown that 96% of unhappy customers don't bother to make a complaint. And actually that straw poll that we've just done more or less evidences that, doesn't it? The process of submitting a complaint and waiting to hear back from an organisation is an experience that already disappointed, angry, frustrated customers will choose to go through. If that experience is bad or nothing special, that will only serve to confirm the customer's already bad impression of your organisation. So it just reinforces their view. And when a customer makes a complaint, they're doing so because they're frustrated, they're distressed, and they're angry, and they ultimately just want the situation to be resolved. Most people who complain to their landlord act reasonably and responsibly, and we have to remember that. Most people who complain to their landlord act reasonably and responsibly, even when they're experiencing high levels of distress, frustration, and anger. But in a very, very small number of cases, customers behave in ways that we are finding unacceptable. So can you run the next poll for me, Matt, please? So the next poll, what percentage of complaints demonstrate unreasonable complainant conduct? In your opinion, what percentage of complaints do you think demonstrate unreasonable complainant conduct? Right, I think most people have voted now, so you can probably safely end the poll, Matt, I think. So share the results. Fantastic. So as you can see, 15 to 20%, 13 of you, 24% of you have said that you think it's 15 to 20%. 11 out of 55, so 20% of you have said you think it's 5 to 8%. And overwhelming majority, 56%, say you think it's 3 to 5%. And I'm not surprised that there are some people who are saying 50 to 20% and some people who are saying 5 to 8%, because actually what we do know is that unreasonable, or what we might consider vexatious behaviour, is only an issue in about 3 to 5% of cases. But it takes considerable resources to manage somebody who is becoming unreasonable or vexatious with you. As Dave Loudon, I don't know if he's on the session today, but he highlighted in a recent article about the hidden cost of complaints. It can be a major source of stress for staff when they're having to deal with someone who is demonstrating unreasonable behaviours and becoming quite vexatious. And it's important to remember that a complainant's conduct isn't necessarily unreasonable just because it's seen as challenging or difficult for you to manage. It's important to remember that, because often people get labelled as unreasonable when in fact they're challenging you. Most people who complain to their landlord are reasonable. But we label people who become difficult to deal with as vexatious or unreasonable. If you look at these examples here, vexatious, difficult to deal with and causing a lot of anger, worry, or argument, as opposed to vexed, when you're annoyed or worried. Generally, people complain because they're vexed. They're annoyed or worried and they're experiencing high levels of distress. You know, they're angry, they're frustrated about the issue that led them to make that huge effort to actually make a complaint. It takes effort to make a complaint. I was running a complaints training yesterday, actually, and when I asked people, why don't you make a complaint? They said to me, because it's too much hassle, because I know I'm not going to like the response that I get back, because I'm worried about the way that I might be perceived by the organisation. So when people do make a complaint to you, they've actually made an effort and they've put themselves out there and left themselves vulnerable. They might need your help to regulate their emotions, because bear in mind our client base as well in social housing, there are some very vulnerable people there who might need your help to regulate their emotions if they're already angry and distressed. How you respond to someone in a heightened state will make the difference between them being vexed, annoyed or worried about a situation, or vexatious, really difficult for you to deal with. During the complaint process, unreasonable or vexatious behaviour can manifest itself in a number of different ways. We get unreasonable persistence, people who just won't let go, keep emailing you, keep ringing you. We keep writing letters. We get unreasonable demands, people who are asking things that they must know you just can't do. Unreasonable lack of cooperation. So you ask them to do things and then they don't cooperate with you. They're putting forward unreasonable arguments. And then they've got unreasonable behaviours such as aggressive or abusive behaviour and harassment. The trick is being able to determine why the customer's behaviour is becoming challenging. And there are a wide range of reasons why some customers behave unreasonably. And they can be divided into sort of the following motivational categories, if you like. So I've put down here needs and expectations. So they might feel that their expectations, their physical needs or their emotional needs aren't being met. Emotions and psychology. So they're highly angry, frustrated or disappointed, and they express those emotions in ways that you find unacceptable. Attitudes. They might be dissatisfied with the person or the organisation or the systems or the processes. And they might have aspirations. So they might be seeking justice or a moral outcome, or they're obsessively pursuing their issue on a matter of principle. And it could just be a hobby for them. So it could be a recreational interest. Or they may have personal or mental health problems that you might know nothing about, actually. It's important to bear in mind that looking at those reasons that I've just highlighted, the majority of them might have been preventable if complaints are managed well from the outset. Do a little bit of root cause analysis, because even with attitudes, when someone's dissatisfied with the organisations or the systems and the processes, you've got to ask yourself why that might be. But the ones that are preventable, in my mind, are when people's needs or expectations aren't being met, when it's around emotions and psychologies because they're highly angry, they're highly frustrated, or they're disappointed and they're expressing those emotions to you, or if they're dissatisfied with a person, the organisation, or the systems and processes. These are all preventable. So what I'd like to do with you today is I'd like to just take you through a little case study. So let me introduce you to Mr. Smith. We're going to follow the progress of a complaint that Mr. Smith made to his landlord. So in 2018, Mr. Smith experienced a leak from the property upstairs, not owned by his rental provider. The leak damaged his ceiling and some of his contents, including his TV, the sofa, and a rug. Mr. Smith phoned his landlord to report the issue, and he asked them to compensate him for the damage to his possessions. Now, this is a real case study, guys. This isn't one I've made up. So at this point, we have to ask ourselves, what does Mr. Smith want? At this point, he's called in to say, I've had a leak from upstairs, it's damaged my ceiling, and some of my contents, my sofa's damaged, my TV's damaged, and the rug in my lounge is damaged. What does Mr. Smith actually want? At this point, all he wanted was for a swift outcome, to be heard and to be listened to. He wanted some empathy. He wanted to know that somebody actually cared, some empathy and some understanding, a real opportunity to be heard and to have some input into the process before any decisions were made. He wanted for his complaint to be properly investigated and for the landlord to act sensitively and impartially, which actually fits nicely into the Ombudsman's 3 principles to sort of outcome-focused dispute resolution. He wanted you to be fair, he wanted the organisation to put things right, and he wanted people to learn from the outcomes. So at this point, it's not really a complaint, it's a service request, isn't it? He's reporting a leak, but it's about to become a complaint because customers have a basic set of expectations of what will happen when they make some sort of complaint, whether that's a service request or a service complaint. And this graph shows the results of a survey where the customer was asked, when you make a complaint, what is the least that you expect and what is your actual experience? And you can see from the graph that there are some key expectations during the complaints management process that are often not met. So those lines in the blue, they're the expectations that a complainant has, and those lines in the red, they're the actual experience. So you can see from the graph that there are some key expectations during the complaints management process that are often not met. Customers just want their complaint to be acknowledged, and that doesn't mean a written acknowledgement in 5 days, as per the Ombudsman's code. That means someone who responds in a human way, takes them seriously, acknowledges there's an issue, shows some empathy, and apologises and takes ownership. Let's go back to Mr. Smith. So the landlord then agreed to repair the ceiling, but he stipulated that they were not responsible for damage to Mr. Smith's contents. Mr. Smith became angry with the landlord and he ended the phone call. The landlord said, "I can arrange for your ceiling to be made safe and repaired, but it's not our policy to provide compensation for your damaged goods in these situations." So he became angry and he ended that phone call. And he terminated that call because the customer service operative had said no to him. It wasn't the fact that the operative had said no that made him angry, it was the way that they said no. There was no professional curiosity, no empathy, no compassion, or any attempt to offer any kind of assistance. They simply said, whilst I can arrange for your ceiling to be made safe and repaired, it's not our policy. No. Computer says no. You should always have contents insurance to cover that. So they even made an accusation about him because he hadn't got contents insurance. And ultimately, he terminated that call because his needs and expectations weren't being met. The operative's attitude made him angry, frustrated and disappointed, and his fight or flight response made him unable to control his emotions. So he put the phone down. People push back and they escalate when they don't trust you, when they fear something, when they feel ignored, when they see you as a threat, when they think you're not listening, when they feel disrespected and overwhelmed. And Mr. Smith was feeling a whole range of those emotions when he ended that call. So what happened next? Mr. Smith sent a lengthy complaint letter. Of course he did, because he'd put that phone down because he didn't feel anyone cared. And now he's still got the issue, so he's got to do something about it. It's not gone away. So he sent a lengthy complaint letter, and the landlord responded to his complaint in writing, holding their decision regarding the contents, and closed the complaint. The landlord didn't contact him. Mr. Smith carried on corresponding with the landlord and involved the MP, and the landlord responded to the ministerial inquiry and maintained their position regarding the damage to his contents. This was a missed opportunity to prevent an escalation and resolve the issue, because arguably this is the pivotal point, because if you get it wrong at this point, you will struggle to recover that person's trust. No point has that landlord contacted Mr. Smith, visited Mr. Smith, attempted to listen, hear and understand his point of view. And guys, it never ceases to amaze me the number of times, and I've been in operational housing management operations for the whole of my career, 32 years. You know, I've been running big picture as my full-time occupation for 4 years. But up until that point, I've been handling stage 1 complaints, stage 2 complaints. It never ceases to amaze me the number of times I've seen people try to respond to complaints without ever contacting the person. You can't possibly know from a letter or an email what is going on for that person in the background that you need to be aware of if you haven't made that phone call or made that attempt to humanize that complaint. So in 2009, there was another escape of water into Mr. Smith's home. The landlord agreed to carry out the repairs, but once again advised they made the same mistake all over again. They once again advised that they weren't liable for any damage to Mr. Smith's contents. And Mr. Smith is now refusing access to carry out any work, and he's making regular calls to threaten legal action and press exposure. He calls the landlord corrupt. He's posted details of his correspondence on social media, and many landlords would now be classing Mr. Smith as unreasonable or vexatious, when in fact, Mr. Smith is vexed. He is vexed by his landlord, and that is why he is behaving that way. So deciding what to do next is where many of us get caught in the rabbits, like rabbits in the rabbits in the headlights, sort of unsure of what way to turn now, what to do with the issue of Mr. Smith, because he's not letting go now. He is a man on a mission. The focus should be on the conduct the person's exhibiting, not the person themselves. Their behavior is unreasonable at this point in time. That's possibly something we can influence if we change our approach. We need to ask ourselves why they're behaving that way, do a root cause analysis, because putting restrictions on someone rarely works unless it's for their benefit. For example, if they've got a mental health issue and it would benefit them to have a single point of contact. Restrictions will simply channel people to find other avenues. Remember what I said about people pushing back? At this point, Mr. Smith doesn't trust anyone. He's pushing back and he's finding other avenues to push back and vent and ultimately destroy the organisation's reputation, because he needs to vent his frustration. He's now sitting there with an issue that he's lost control of, and so has the organisation. And unreasonable complainant conduct rarely comes as a surprise. There are generally some warning signs for you that someone may become unreasonable at some point if you're not really careful. And when a risk assessment at stage 1 of a complaint can save you a lot of time, money, and stress later on. You know, taking into consideration things like the nature of the complaint, the style and tone of communication. Was there a lot of bolding and underlining and highlighting in it? The urgency behind the communication. These things should all inform the nature of your response. You have to ask yourself, will a 5-day acknowledgement suffice, or should I be calling them to have a chat? And I would argue, as I've already said, that at the very least, every complainant should receive a phone call, and depending on the need, a home visit. You can't possibly understand the fundamental issues of a complaint via an email or a letter. When someone is making a complaint to you, you need to build trust and rapport from the very first contact. The very first contact. You need to consider the complainant's history. You know, has there been frequent contact and complaints? Have there been previous displays of unreasonable behaviour? Is there known substance abuse or mental health issues? And you have a duty under the Equality Act to make sure reasonable adjustments for people with mental health conditions are made. So essentially, the most effective way for you to manage a customer's challenging behaviour is for you to manage their complaint well from the outset. And when things escalate, manage your response to the behaviour being exhibited rather than attempting to control the person. And as we say at Big Picture, take a look in the mirror and ask yourself, how does it feel to be on the receiving end of an interaction with me? If I'd made this complaint and I had received the responses that me as a landlord has sent, how would I be feeling right now? Would I be getting frustrated and annoyed? Would I be looking at ways to get myself heard? Because above all, and this is what I'm going to leave you with, and we'll go into a nice discussion now, above all, complainants are human beings. Behind every one of those statistics that you've got, whether it's 178 complaints or 3 complaints, there is a human being who is angry, frustrated, annoyed, upset, emotionally distressed by you. It's always about the people.
Thank you very, very much, Jo. There are a number of points that have come up in the chat, which I'm going to go
bet.
through in a moment.
I could see it because I'm used to doing Zoom. I'm thinking I shouldn't be looking at the chat. I've got to focus on what I'm saying.
It's all
Yeah.
good. If anyone would like to come in, please use the reactions tab at the bottom of the page and raise hand, or drop me a message and say you'd like to come in. I can bring you in. Straight off the bat, Jo, do come in, because I'll go to you first before we go to the chat. So lovely to have you with us today.
Hiya, Jo. You're all right. I think from one of the things I'm looking at, and it's more of a comment really, is from what you've been talking about, and as you know, I'm a very big advocate on this, is this links nicely into the Ombudsman Spotlight report for the relationship of equals attitudes, and
Yeah,
the one that came out. Yeah. And for me, it's around how I'm looking at our whole customer policy in terms with how we deal with customers who have any issues that we need to be aware of. And I can see Claire on the call on the table as well, and taking into account their data and why we're using their data. But it's also, for me, is I'm writing a new vulnerability policy, but for me, vexatious customers, I don't really believe in that term, are are absolutely linked into some form of vulnerability, not necessarily about physical or mental, but they are vulnerable because by the very nature they're vexed or vexatious.
Yeah, and I would caution against labeling someone who is becoming vexatious as vulnerable, because frankly, I've become a vexatious complainant in the past, and I don't consider myself at all vulnerable in any way, shape, or form. Actually, incredibly intelligent and know the system really well. So just really off. That's what I am. Because I can predict what's going to happen, and it's just happened to me. And why is no one listening? I just want something simple sorted out, and why can't it happen? So I would caution against saying people are vulnerable because they're vexatious. They're not vulnerable, they're really annoyed. Really annoyed. Sometimes their vexatiousness is coming out because of their vulnerability, and they might struggle to control their emotions because of their vulnerability. But sometimes people are only just barely controlling their emotions and coming across as vexatious or unreasonable because they are trying so hard to control their emotions.
Absolutely. I think for me, it's not about them being vulnerable in the traditional housing terms of vulnerable, but it's almost how we adapt our behaviour and our responses to meet the customer's needs, as opposed to, if they're naffed off, it's how you adjust your style as opposed to the vulnerability. So absolutely.
Absolutely, Jo. Behaviour is at the key of all of this. And if every organisation lived their values, and all of our values, all organisations, even big picture trading's values include words like respect and collaboration and integrity. If everyone lived those values, we'd be in a much better place. But we're all human beings too. And so sometimes our responses aren't great, but we do need to tailor our response to the person, because one broad brush won't fit all. Absolutely.
This episode of the Social Housing Roundtable is sponsored by Alertical. Alertical helps as many people as possible feel safe, connected and informed by combining ingenious technology and award-winning human contact. Alertical's digital engagement solution helps social landlords proactively know their customers and properties by putting a portable touchscreen in every home offering a daily property check through the optional OK Each Day service, plus repairs reporting, tenant surveys, and much more. They also provide beyond warden calls, an easier, simpler, and lower cost wireless warden call solution with video door entry, dispersed telecare, and smoke alarms. Alert Call works with over 60 housing providers across the UK to enhance two-way engagement between customers and landlords. In 2022, Alert Call won the Queen's Award for Enterprise and Innovation, and in 2023 won Housing Supplier of the Year. I'm delighted to have them as our sponsor of the Social Housing Roundtable throughout 2024. There's a couple of points on that came in on the chat, actually. Judith Ratcliffe had mentioned about how it basically comes down to trust and whether or not there is that, the big breakdown in trust around this, but also Lucy Ryan, complainants I speak to are both vexatious and vexed. What I generally find is that the majority of customers who complain do not know how to clearly communicate their concern, query, worry, issue to the correct person or department. Working in social housing, our customers have a lot more complex support needs. And I think on that, on one side, completely agree. On the other side, how accessible your complaints process is another huge, huge piece. And we will definitely come back to some points on that. But I'm going to bring in Susan first, because this is already looking excellent. So Susan, over to you.
Oh, I'm going to put it touchy down to the lack of proper training of all your staff. Half of these complaints wouldn't come in the first place if the staff in the sort of repairs department had proper training on people's needs. I mean, I've currently got a front door where they've come to repair it, change the handle. It's supposed to have a split spindle on it so it locks automatically. For 45 days, I did not know it hadn't got a split spindle until I'm in bed one morning and a stranger walked into my house. For 45 days, my house has been open to anybody, even when I've been to the hospital. When I spoke to the officers, they were saying, well, the door's perfectly serviceable, but it didn't meet my needs. When they looked, if they'd read my referral from OT, they'd have realised that. And so I actually think it's down to a lack of training and understanding people's needs. And therefore, half of these complaints wouldn't come in the first place if there was proper training in place to start with.
Well, Susan, I couldn't agree with you more on that, obviously, because I run a trading organisation. But I actually agree with you. And this is one of my biggest frustrations at the moment. One of my biggest frustrations, we're often called in to provide training to front-facing staff. It's not only the front-facing teams that need the training, because people who are dealing with stage 1 complaints often aren't front-facing. They're often at operational management level and are no longer front-facing. So, it's everyone. It's everyone that needs that. The maintenance officer, surveyor, everyone needs that complaints training. And everyone needs to consider the human being behind every report rather than applying a broad brush policy approach. It's a serviceable door. Yeah, but what about the person who's using it? Is it serviceable for them? Yeah.
Actually,
And it comes back to that piece, doesn't it, around just how many, and the amount of businesses I know where managers each are responsible for complaints within their division, but because they're a manager, so of course you can deal with a complaint. Sorry, Susan.
And you're right. People wouldn't phone me back because they assumed the door was correct. And so nobody spoke to me. And then it got to the director of housing, and she was going to be seeing me that night, and she came and sat down and asked me to tell her about the story of my door. And soon as I told her, I've got a brand new door on order, they're going to just replace the entire door.
And Susan, that is perfect, because that should have happened at the first point of contact. Somebody should have had some professional curiosity around that and asked you those questions. It should never have escalated to the director of housing for you to, it should have been at the first point of contact.
So what I'm doing after, I've been keeping copious notes, as I do because I'm on the scrutiny panel. And once my door is fitted, I'm now going to then send them a list of all the things that worked well, all things that didn't work so well, and things they didn't consider, and what they should have done. And I'm going to I am going to give it them two barrels, because I'm really angry that a complete stranger walked into my home, and
so
the fact that I have left my house thinking that door was locked. Somebody could have emptied it out, and I wouldn't have even known I'd been burgled, because the door would have been shut when I got back.
That's fantastic, Margot, and hopefully they learn from they learn from those. Why have I said Margot? That's fantastic, and hopefully they learn from that. Those learnings that you're going to send them.
Thank you, Susan, for sharing. Donna, I'm going to bring you in.
Hi all. Yeah, I suppose there's a couple of things really. I don't really like the term vexatious. I just think it's sort of, it doesn't give you the best sort of image of a complainant really. If they're
Negative.
complaining, yeah, we've done, we've got something wrong. But just on that really is when we do have some unreasonable behaviour within that complaint, it's then how that's being managed. We've got an unreasonable behaviour procedure and everything in place. But for me, I think the last couple of complaints that we've had where there has been unreasonable behaviour, all of the complaints were dealt with, resolved and managed. And if there was any repair, all of that was resolved and a plan put in place. But they still became unreasonable because what they hadn't sort of reiterated to us at the beginning is what their long-term goal was. So in a couple of the instances, the complainant wanted to move, but thought that going through the complaints process and bringing in lots of issues about the property would get them that move, instead of saying to us at the beginning, this property isn't suitable for me anymore, and what can you do to help. It was, we'll bring up another issue about the property, and that's how the unreasonable behaviour progressed, because all of the complaints were dealt with and resolved satisfactory. But this one little issue, and if we'd have known in the beginning, it's that, okay, let's help you, let's get you on this transfer list, let's have a look for different properties for you. So yeah, unfortunately there are a couple of times when it isn't communicated to us, and then we're on the back foot constantly really.
Yeah, and that's interesting. That's where your professional curiosity comes in right at the outset, actually, Donna, isn't it? If somebody had, and it just put me in mind when you said that of the Fiona Pilkington case back in the day, ultimately the coroner, the outcome of that was the coroner said if somebody had just sat her down and had a cup of tea with her, they would have figured out what the issues were and combined all the stories, and this would never have happened. And it's, it comes back to that with complaints. I know we're feeling overwhelmed by the level of complaints, but if we do some triage right at the beginning and we work out those that, are burning issues, they're going to catch fire, they're the ones we maybe need to treat slightly differently, and pick up that phone, go and visit them, sit down and have a chat. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what we've been doing. So with any now where we sort of get that hint at the very beginning of that there's a bigger issue here, then all of the housing team, the repairs team, any support and enablement teams all come together and go, right, okay, what can we do to support this person? So our unreasonable complaints are very, very low. If we have 1 or 2 a year, then that's probably,
and that's
one or two
much
many
less than
thoughts.
3 to 5%, isn't it? Much
Yes.
less. Yeah.
I can see in the chat, so there's a point from Judith, which ties into a little bit what we were saying. Unreasonable persistence, maybe because their complaint hasn't been properly answered in the first place. We're not getting to the core basis of actually what's gone wrong. Claire Blacker, when thinking about unreasonable behavior in complaints, I often talk about our own psychological backpacks, how we all have a backpack of coping skills, resilience, and some people, particularly those who've experienced trauma, have small backpacks with limited or poor resources. We need to bear this in mind and have understanding for different levels of skills and thinking of different ways to work.
I like that. I've written it down.
Yeah, absolutely. And Nadine, I think this would make anyone vexed as all of his household items are damaged. Poor man might not be able to avoid his contents back. Again, it's getting to the core reason of the complaint. Ellie, I think this is the point where company values are so important. If the customer service operative focuses on delivering the values of the organization, i.e. empathy, and applies them to the situation, it will make a difference. And it tied into someone else who I know mentioned, sometimes you've just literally got to pick up the phone. Although we live in a digital world, pick up the phone. Pick up the phone. Liz, the first thing I do when I receive a complaint is call the customer. Ellie backing that up, saying you can't hear tone of voice in a letter. Kim Sutton, as someone who runs a homeless service, we see people who are in crisis. And a lot of the most serious cases we see is due to services not being flexible and unable to adjust. I hear lack of engagement too much, and this being said to people who are rough sleeping with mental health issues. There's a balance we've got to go through. And then Nasir, just before I bring in Carolyn, Some social housing landlords did practice, and others seem to adapt a policy of labelling and form of censorship to avoid customers and tenants airing legitimate grievances. I volunteered and advocated for people with safeguarding issues and additional needs, which were never considered by the landlord until interventions were made on their behalf. And this is something which, as I mentioned before, I work in recruitment. Complaints is the one area where I've recruited more in the last 12 months than anything else. And it's getting busier and busier and busier because people are starting to deep dive, starting to really go, how good is our complaints policy? Let's just check some of these, and suddenly opening up a beehive of, and it's just getting bigger and bigger. And it's exactly what happened with the Ombudsman, as Jo mentioned earlier. In the end of 2022, the dispute resolution team was about 26 people across the dispute resolution team, and another team now, it's over 400. They are blowing up because of trying to deal with all the issues we've got going on. Carolyn, lovely to have you with us. Do please come in.
Sorry, there's been so much said, I kind of lost my train of thought, because every time someone says something, I go, oh, yes, that's a marvellous point. I come from the third sector predominantly, so I'm new to housing, reasonably new, 5 years this October. But I think for me, I work in complaints now consistently, and that training from the third sector with mental health and victims of crime has been absolutely a godsend to me in this role. Understanding the emotions behind the person when they call, you know, hearing it in their voice, some trauma-informed training that has been really, really, you know, to fall back on. Really building that rapport with the person on the telephone and understanding what their issues are and what they want, what their outcomes they're looking for. Taking time over it as well so that they don't feel rushed. There's a lack of advocacy available in this sector for customers that struggle. There used to be some funded advocacy by local authorities for housing services, and I'm not sure if that's available now or where it is. So we are kind of carrying out that role for more vulnerable customers as well. We're trying to advocate and help them to have their best voice heard as part of the process. The problem with that is, you know, you've got to balance that with the time constraints that you've got in order to be able to respond. So, you know, I do get told off for extending from time to time. But I just
you will, because you'll be missing the and that's the problem with targets, isn't it? That's the problem with targets. But as long as you've come up with an action plan, that's your final response. You've met that 10-day deadline. You know, that's the important thing. Have you created an action plan that everyone can agree on? Because if you have, that's your 10-day response.
Yeah, it is challenging, but I think we're getting there. I think we need people to be less defensive and more open, more opportunity for reflection around the actual services we're delivering, and more resources really for people, because it's that lack of resource and that lack of time that leads to decision making not being the best it possibly can. So I think it's a very exciting time, and I think we've got a lot of work to do, but I think the outcomes eventually, after a little bit longer of this, will definitely be beneficial to the customers at the end of the day.
That's where triaging is so important, because you can save yourself time at the early. It's time management, effectively, isn't it? You can save yourself time by stopping those things from catching fire. Yeah.
I'm going to bring in Sheila, Lisa, and then I'm going to go to a point which has gone quite entertainingly in the chat, or which was raised initially by Lucy. So Sheila, I'm going to bring you in first.
Lovely, thank you. Yeah, great session, Jo. Having spent 20 years in housing doing customer service, I can honestly say I've probably met 2 genuinely vexatious customers over my time, and the others, and even those, I think were probably caused by the way that they were treated in the first place. I think for me, definitely, it's all about people, and I actually have quite a big problem with process and policy. I understand there has to be policy and process, but what happens then is we hide behind it. And sometimes it puts things in the place. I mean, in your scenario, the first thing is like, oh no, you've got to have your own contents insurance. That's the policy. Nobody, let's not talk about it any further. And actually, maybe if there's a 10-day deadline, well, that might be all right for some cases, but actually some customers don't mind waiting 30 days as long as the situation gets resolved and as long as there's contact along the way so that they know. And sometimes we try and force things in, round things into a square hole that doesn't actually fit with policy. So I think that this is about people being genuinely interested. Your point about curiosity, I'm a big fan of curiosity. This is about staff being genuinely interested and having the resource and the empowerment to actually deal with those issues at the first point of contact. But there's also the issue about root cause analysis, because we see the same complaints happen over and over again because we're not actually fixing the problem. And a lot of this, of course, comes down to time and resource. But I think that we misplace sometimes the resource. It needs to be all at the front end. The people at the front end need to be dealing with it, asking the right questions, having the authority to do what needs to be done at that front end. And just one final point, I completely agree that customer service is all about everybody in the organisation, not just those people on the front line.
And you're so right, Sheila. I had a conversation with somebody a couple of weeks ago where I said, 25% of your complaints are escalating to stage 2. Why is that? And they said, we don't know. We haven't got time to figure that out. And I sat there and I just thought, that's where your problem lies. You're not putting the resources in the right places. Yeah.
Thank you.
Lisa, sorry, Sheila. Oh no, thank you. Lisa, do come in.
Thank you. Sheila, on the nose, that completely on the nose. I agree with everything you just said. And Susan, when we're talking about having the whole housing association know and understand what our customers are thinking, are feeling, or what's going on in their lives, I think you're absolutely right. I think a lot of the issues that I've come across is when other people within services, so maintenance, have gone out and they've made promises, but it's not something that they've ever going to be able to follow through. It's just whatever's been easiest to say at that time when they've been visiting, which causes a lot of problems. I think for me, it's like really digging that deep. And you've just, again, Jo, you just mentioned it there. It's not understanding stage 2s. Those customer journeys and those case studies are really value for money, aren't they? You get so much from them. I did one recently with a repair with a leak. And it's outstanding, the amount of emails and the amount of people that were involved and the length of time it took and the money that was, it's just, and I think if we can kind of have those conversations across the board with different service areas about, bringing that case study to life and showing people, actually, this is what happens when you do this. This is what happens if you don't do this. It gives a bit of meaning to it, rather than just these stats that nobody really particularly cares about. Actually put a face, a name, a customer journey to it, and give a bit of depth to it, actually. And you would only need to do a certain percentage of that just to get a true reflection of what's going on within the organisation. And you're right, it's down to processes and giving people those opportunities to resolve first time, the resources that they need. And those customer facing people know those people the best. They're able to ask those questions, watch how people are behaving. I think you're right. I've not had very many vexatious. I've probably had one. It was a tag team of sisters, that sort of did one thing or another. But the other one that was labelled vexatious verbally across the organisation, it wasn't. It was down to mental health and having a lot of other issues. But if you've got to dig deep to find that information out, it's been really useful this course. So thank you very much, Matt.
You're very welcome, and it's lovely to have you with us. And like I say, there's a reason that I brought you on board, because this is what you live and breathe daily. And a few points from the chat, and then I'll come back to Susan in just a moment. So, I mean, Kim had mentioned training's the key, and also culture change within an organisation. When I applied for funding and got it for a 3-year health project at our service, but why do I need to do this? Because many of our rough sleepers were denied access to a GP because of gatekeeping by reception staff who didn't know the law and their lack of understanding. Jo Simcox, I feel the term professional curiosity interesting, and something I champion within my organisation to be more curious. I'm not sure we have enough of it in the sector. Elizabeth Williams has said there's some excellent software apps available in the market now for repairs and complaints, which enable better tracking. And Imran has said communication is key. We need to show empathy, compassion, but most of all, a genuine care and need to resolve the complaining to a swift resolution. But we also need to be aware of the complex needs of our customers and have this at the forefront of how we deal with our customers. Elizabeth Williams, another point is that as a tenant, you feel completely out of control of the issues in your own home. That can become deeply unsettling, and having to deal with strangers, especially in your own home, can be really invasive. It's not just us in housing, though. It's across the board. As businesses get bigger and bigger, we lose the local customer interface we always used to have. What upsets me the most is a culture of complaints being seen as a pain instead of being seen as a paying customer who deserves the best. And I think what's really interesting on that is we're starting to see, particularly around the new consumer standards, a massive, massive reversal in terms of patch size. Rather than patch sizes being in the high hundreds or even beyond 1,000, suddenly reducing to 100, 200, we're seeing community teams being created again to know customers again and to get on top of exactly this kind of stuff. Now, the thing that really kind of kicked off in the chat, Jo, which is what I wanted to bring you in on before I bring in Susan for the last couple of minutes. So there's a point from Lucy Ryan. Complainants I speak to are both vexatious and vexed. What I generally find is that the majority of customers who complain do not know how to clearly communicate their issue. We mentioned this point before. Working in social housing, we have a lot of complex issues. So many people seem to have lost the skills of basic communication and human interaction, which leads to customers being unheard, misunderstood, or rushed. The counter argument, which came from Elizabeth originally, was I don't think we should be blaming or criticizing tenants' communication skills. We're there to provide a service to them, not the other way around. It's up to us to learn how to listen inclusively. It's their home and to be their safe place, and it's incredibly stressful. The flip side, claim from Claire, it's not about blaming their skills. It's about understanding that people have different resources to respond to different and stressful situations. It's our responsibility to find ways to deal with those situations. And then Adriano said, I agree. There are customers, we are being paid every month. So no customers, no wages. And there's one other point that come in on it. I'll see if I can find it. No, that was on a different point altogether. Where do you stand on this? Because both sides aren't wrong, but inevitably our policy, if we come down to policy and having to be policy led, can only lead in one way.
Let me just say this. When I go into an organisation and the first sign I see is please be polite and respectful to our staff, it immediately makes me question why I wouldn't want to be polite and respectful to their staff, because most people don't go into an organisation to have a row. Okay? Most people go into